And I'm gonna start the first in a series of lectures about immigration that will go on from now until the end of the semester. I think it'll be like 4 or 5 lectures on the topic. So this is the first of them. One of the themes I like to emphasize with regard to immigration is unintended consequences, where we pass laws with the goal of achieving one thing, and then there's some unintended consequence that comes as a result. Something that they didn't see at the time. All right, one of the first waves of immigrants that came to the United States that were not English was the German. And they came in the mid 18th century. And Germans were seen as people that were never going to assimilate. They were seen as people that were, they drank too much, which contrasted with the whole kind of Protestant ideas of, not drinking too much. So yeah, they were seen as rowdy drinkers. And till this day, I think Germans are how do I put it, the ancestry that's most common in the US for Anglo-American people. Here's an example of how people saw the Germans in the mid 18th century. This is a quote from Benjamin Franklin in 1755, and he was concerned about non-English immigrants, especially the Germans, and this is what he had to say. He said that they are, quote, herding together, establishing their language and manners to the exclusion of ours. Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens, who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs, any more than they can acquire our complexion? So I'm gonna break it down a little bit there. One, for starters, these descriptions of them as aliens, as herds, herds are a term, herd is a term we use for animals, not for people. But they're herding together, establishing their languages instead of learning ours. So, using the term aliens, this idea that they're gonna, they're not assimilating, they're trying to convert us instead of us converting them to our language. This idea that they're never gonna learn our language and customs. A lot of these things, today to us seem kind of absurd, but this is what people thought. And a lot of these same things get repeated with every wave of immigrants that comes in throughout history. We have the same reaction. That's why people talk about, historians always seeing history repeating itself. And we see this over and over. Now, another thing we learned early in the semester was this idea of the social construction of race. And here we get a peek into that, because he's describing Germans as being of a different skin color than the English. And when I talk about different groups, you'll see that, where there's this racialization of immigrant groups that eventually end up being considered white. But at the time, they were seen as non-white or different. The Irish, 100 years later, in the mid 19th century, they were also seen as people who drank too much. Hence, saying that they drink rum. But with the Irish, they took it even a step further. They would say that, or they were racialized, where you see them, where they're portrayed as not even being human. Talk about dehumanizing people. These portrayals are not portraying them as human. They're not just a different race, it's like they're a different species. And of course, they're fighting against the police, and it's the media, the print media at the time, saying, it's their version of "We Back the Blue," support the police in, against these rowdy immigrants that are fighting against our police. And, these immigrants like to riot. And so, yeah, the Irish were discriminated against. I touched on this when I talked about the Mexican-American War, where the Irish were seen as, were distrusted, in large part because they were Catholic. And there was this idea that Catholic people could never be loyal to the United States, or that they needed to be distrusted because their primary loyalty was to the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, not to the US president. And so there was this idea of them as being disloyal. And Irish Americans, they just dress themselves in the US flag, but, they're no different. Again, being portrayed as some kind of humanoid animal with a tail. And, being given a concession to violence. The Irish committing crime, committing murder. Again, the newspaper referring to them as the most recently discovered wild beasts. Even if they're not immigrants, even if they're born in the US. And so here we're looking at a generation later. And so, first it's the immigrants, and then it's their children that are being portrayed as violent people. And some sources, even from Shakespeare. Here's a portrayal of Florence Nightingale, as opposed to an Irish Bridget MacBruiser. Again, the portrayal of the Irish as being, in a way, even more than just of a different race. Talk about, again, dehumanizing portrayals of people. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it's people from Southeastern Europe, Italians being a significant portion of that. And we see a lot of similar tropes, a lot of similar statements being made about them. They, they bother people walking by, they bother pedestrians. This is how they live. They live all super together, sleeping on top of one another. Their idea of an afternoon pleasant diversion is violence. They're portrayed with knives because they're prone to drawing blood. They don't fight fair, and the only way to deal with them is to get rid of them. And so the way to arrest them is you beat them up with a billy club into a paddy wagon and get rid of them. And so, again, support the police, support the beating up of immigrants, get rid of them. Paddy wagons, that's where they get their name from, being used for the Irish before the Italians. And so, yeah, we see with each wave of immigration, the same tropes, the same repeated statements being applied to different groups. then there is the Chinese, and I'm going back chronologically a little bit here. Because the Chinese started coming to the United States as part of the gold rush. They were going to California for the same reason everybody was going to California in 1850, to try to strike it rich, mining gold. The Chinese called the gold rush, they called it Gold Mountain. This idea that there was a mountain full of gold and they wanted to take part in it. But we were already introduced to the foreign miners tax that discouraged foreigners, or people perceived as foreigners, from mining. They were seen as competition from the very beginning. So the Chinese turned to jobs that were less desirable but in demand by the majority single men who were going out west to try to strike it rich in the gold rush. So they grew vegetables and sold vegetables in the market. They opened laundries, places where they would do people's laundry of all these single men that were going west to strike it rich in gold. And this is also because there was a sense of that there wasn't a lot of women out west, and so there was a demand for anyone to do laundry. But it was also seen as, I don't know, kind of women's work, and so then respectable Anglo-American men didn't want to do laundry, and so the Chinese would have to do that. They also got involved in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad was the first railroad to connect to the Pacific Ocean, and it was being built simultaneously from east to west and from west to east. The part that was going from west to east had a majority Chinese labor force. From west to east was more difficult because they were going over the California, I think they're called the Sierra Nevada mountains, between California and Nevada. And so that stretch being built from west to east had to go through the mountains. It was much more difficult to build. It was a lot more dangerous to build. They had to use a lot of dynamite to be able to build the railroad. And so lots of people died, majority of which were Chinese. So, similarly, there comes a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. Here's one example, this advertisement in 1883 with a patent for this new machine, a new washing machine, the Missouri Steam Washer, is being advertised as, buy this washing machine and we won't need the Chinese anymore. We can get rid of them. We can get rid of the Chinese, people who do laundry with this machine. Another example of anti-Chinese sentiment, this was in Southern California in Los Angeles. There was an incident in 1871 where in Chinatown of Los Angeles, there were two Chinese groups. They referred to them as Tongs. Tongs is have these implications of being like street gangs. And so they were referred to that way. These two Chinese groups fought over a woman. Presumably this woman, they were both claiming to own this woman. And presumably she was a prostitute in the red light district in Chinatown. So these two groups got in a fight. A police officer got involved and got shot. And this started a riot. There was an Anglo-American saloon keeper that was going around shooting at Chinese homes. This happened on a street called Calle de los Negros, which it was named during Spanish and Mexican California time. But when it was part of the United States, they would call it N-word Alley. Today it still exists. It is literally Los Angeles Street in downtown Los Angeles. So there were over 500 people who descended on Chinatown and burned it down and looted. And they were, primarily Anglo-Americans, and included kind of people that how do I put this? The people that we assume are like respectable citizens of society, like a city councilman or the tax collector for the city. There were 17 Chinese people that were lynched. And it also included Californios. These were people of Mexican descent, also participated in these riots against the Chinese. With that said, there were also some Anglo-Americans who defended the Chinese, who saved the lives of some Chinese individuals from getting lynched. And so, again, if you're interested in learning more, there's this book, The Chinatown War, by Scott Sesh. Anti-Chinese sentiment, in a way, reached its height with the National Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which made the Chinese the most excluded group by US immigration law and US history. I would argue, and you don't have to agree with me, I think that this was because the Chinese were seen as the most foreign. If the Irish were portrayed as being of a different race, and imagine a non-European, non-white group. If the Germans were believed that it was believed that they would never learn English, imagine again people who who don't speak even a European language. And then if the Irish were discriminated against for being Catholic, imagine people who were not even a type of Christian. And so that's why I think it happened. Again, you don't have to agree with me. One example of the growth of these kinds of sentiments would be the Native American political party. They were also known as the Know-Nothings because they would try to keep it a secret. They were members of the Native American Party, but when people asked them if they were members of the Native American Party, they would say they didn't know anything about that. And so then people jokingly would refer to them as the Know-Nothings because they always say they didn't know anything. They were anti-Chinese and anti-Catholic. So when they say Native American, they weren't referring to Native American indigenous people. They were referring to Anglo-American US-born people as Native American. That's what they meant by it, not indigenous, Indians or Native Americans.